Welcome to this series around innovation for sustainable development. Why is this topic important? Environmental pollution, ecological degradation, greenhouse gas emissions, floodings, heat waves, pollution of microbes in the sea. Should I use a plastic cup or a paper cup? Should I use tap water in a plastic container which is disposable or a durable one? We're often as consumers and individuals faced with a number of dilemmas, and this is really the case when we actually have already our basic needs already fulfilled. For a number of countries, for a number of people, a large amount of the population does not have that luxury. We are way too many people in this world, and problems get accelerated and they get worse because of the population growth. With the amount of people living in this earth, we actually are facing a number of global challenges, whether it is security of energy, or whether it is health, or whether it is peace and conflict resolution, whether it is clean water or efficient use of natural resources, restoration of the ecological balance of natural ecosystems. The truth is that according to scientists, we had already surpassed the carrying capacity of Earth. There is a consensus that we have reached a point where climate has changed. Climate will continue being changing, and all of these problems impact more and in a larger extent to those countries and regions which are most vulnerable, meaning insular states, islands, meaning those countries were high inequality with high amount of population, mega cities. So it is really a point in time where action needs to be done, and then innovation is seen as a solution to all of these issues, whether it is making choices in what you do or avoiding what you buy. The capacity of people to enact change is considered to be one of the most influential elements, but truth is that the production and consumption system still needs certain amount of growth per year to maintain its operational efficiency, its economic gains, and we are trapped in what the scholars call a lock-in effect, where we still need technology, we still need production, we still need satisfaction of needs, and all of this keeps on generating greenhouse gas emissions, and resources are more and more scarce, and it is a really complicated and complex issue. Until now, most of the attention has been devoted to carbon emissions, and many policies, many governments, they talk about carbon, but what about sulfur? What about dioxins? What about ozone? What about quality and degradation of earth, of soil? I mean, there is many things that we actually don't see. And worldwide, the attention it is put on energy, on water, and food, which is pressing areas, of course. But there are many other areas that require attention, and whether innovation is needed, is usable, is adequate or not. Well, the truth is that we need solutions that are green, solutions that are inclusive, solutions that are adequate, and at a cost that society can afford. But in the end, these solutions are provided by companies, whether they are for-profit or non-for-profit. Companies, they need to keep operating, they need to maintain the license to operate, and in all of this, technology is seen as one of the enablers and one of the solutions. But innovation doesn't necessarily equal technology. Innovation is a process. It's a process from idea generation to the conceptualization of that possible solution, and then trying, prototyping, scaling up, and putting it into use. So innovation as a process can lead to the generation of technology, but that's one of the many possibilities or one of the many types of innovation. Innovation can be new products, it can be new services, it can be new management methods, it could be new business models, it could be new policy instruments, it can be new forms of financing. So whether these are green or not, well, that's necessarily not the intention of solutions of innovation, but if they have a positive environmental and social impact, then we can talk about that these innovations are supporting sustainable development. Now, the truth is also that this is a topic that nowadays already represents 14% of the gross domestic product of countries such as Germany, a country that has about 14% of the global market of 6 or 7 areas of the eco-industry, water technologies, recycling technologies, you name them. And this is an area of economic development that is growing even in saturated markets. I can give you a number of examples, between 4% to 15%, depending on the economic sector that you're talking about. But in new markets, growth is actually much higher. Growth is about 30, 35, 40%, depends on the sector you're talking. And the margins, profit margins, in some cases are about 30, 40, 50% compared to alternative products. Cost reduction between 20 to 40%, and return on investment between 2 to 12 years. If you're a business person, you would tell me, where do I sign up? If you're a government, you would tell me, hang on, that sounds positive. What about environmental gains? It is a case that many of these technologies bring about short-term and mid-term environmental gains, but we are not so sure about long-term environmental gains. Think, for example, of the critical materials that are required by a number of new technologies. Think, for example, mobile phones, or think, for example, the wind turbines. The special materials needing for the generators. So it is true that we have more certainty that until now, innovations that support environmental sustainability, eco-innovations or green innovations, are actually contributing to short-term, mid-term environmental gains, and we need to make sure how is the long-term going to look like. So with figures that tell you that you can create employment and you can create growth, for example, in the Netherlands in 2013, a number of areas of the circular economy, instead of having a linear way of, extracting, producing, distributing, and throwing away, but making it circular, adding this recycling reusability element and then closing the loops, it actually represents 9.2 billion euros additional to the Dutch GDP and about 15,000 new jobs. 15,000 new jobs, which are actually highly paid, in between 50,000 to 100,000 euros a year. It's not bad, huh? Now, if you're a consumer or a consumer organization, you may think, well, yeah, this all sounds wonderful, but do we really need new technology? Maybe not. In this area of green innovation, now I've already explained the difference between technology and innovation, but in this area, you need new forms of collaboration. You need new forms of establishing public and private partnership. You need lots of new business models. You need lots of behavioral change. So there is a role for civil society and consumers as well. And if you're an academic that has been working in other areas, you would be surprised to know that at least, to our count, there are more than 20 different disciplines that are working in this topic, and they just call it differently. They don't really communicate with one another. If you're working on product design, there is someone out there who is working in something very similar, but he doesn't call it sustainable products. They call it frugal products. Or if you are in the area of energy systems and then you're talking about low carbon technologies, well, there is someone somewhere else in the world who's actually producing knowledge, or it's applying knowledge in areas, but they just call it the nexus because they're linking water with energy and with food. So just to tell you that this is not a new thing. Innovation for sustainable development, it is a new concept, or it is a relatively recent concept that the knowledge base has been established or has been growing in the last 20 or so years. But green technologies and green solutions, they're actually as old as the Industrial Revolution. Let me give you just one example. The Leblanc method in the UK, in the first Industrial Revolution, 1830. So why is this relevant? Well, that method for producing actually chemicals was very, very basic. You know, you had a factory, and you put things in a container, and then you produce something else. And that production was actually releasing lots of toxic gas to the environment, and the owner of the company was actually brought to court, not because he was polluting, but because everybody around the company, the small company, was actually complaining that people were getting sick and the clothes were getting yellow, and well, this guy had to do something about it. And he actually got in contact, his name was James Mospert, and he actually got in contact with another person who was a salesman of chemicals. And then, well, if you have a problem with your gases, why don't you install a chimney? If you don't see it, it doesn't harm, right? And that's what they did. They installed really tall chimneys so the gases would diffuse, and it wouldn't be a problem for the immediate vicinity, but it would be still a problem, right? And still didn't work out. Still, by 1860s, the first alkali law was established. They say, well, you need to do something about it. But it was only because the very same process, the very same chimney that was still causing problems, well, because of the requirements of the law, they actually put lots of branches and trees inside the chimney to create the first wet scrubber. So they say, well, you have a problem with gases, why don't you add water? So adding water to the gases, and then basically problem solved. You don't see it, right? Well, actually, well, the gas was now in the water, and the water was ending up in the river, and the problem wasn't really solved. But these guys were really smart, because they said, well, hang on, there is value in the water that we are producing, because they were basically producing chloride, and then they started bottling the water with gases, which is actually the first byproduct and the first chemical byproduct in history. So if you think about it in terms of what we call now circular economy or industrial symbiosis, well, it comes from back in the day. This is really historical evidence, anecdotal to a large extent. But what it tells you is that social pressures, production of something that was then needed, and it's still needed nowadays, the combination of social pressure actually led to change, and then the regulation came into place. And with this alkali law, by 1980s, a number of these wet scrubbers were installed elsewhere in the UK, and then in continental Europe. So this story may sound anecdotal to you. Well, the very same company that I'm talking about, the first company that was actually was a company called Lever. And then that company was bought by another company in the Netherlands, or from the Netherlands, and then you may guess which company I'm talking about. So this is not something new. It's something that has a lot of history, and what happens in modern practice is that we need innovation, we need products, services, technology, and it is about innovation for sustainable development and innovation oriented towards sustainability. It actually means different things for depending who you are. If you are a company in the manufacturing sector, if you are a company in the clean tech sector, if you are a business intermediary, if you're in research and innovation, if you're in government, if you're in civil society. But roughly speaking, if we can agree that there are a number of targets or mechanisms that you can implement, whether those targets aiming at institutional change, organizational change, marketing and managerial change, processes and products, and then you talk about modifying things, redesigning things, finding alternatives, or the creation of new solutions, then you can actually identify something that the OECD proposed in the year 2010 as the mechanisms for going from pollution control to something that is called industrial ecology. As I told you, well, it actually has happened for a long time. But this process of building gradually the capacities and putting the resources or aligning the resources and bringing innovation and change from just controlling the pollution to moving to cleaner production, to eco-efficiency, to life cycle thinking, to closed loop manufacturing, or to industrial ecology if you are in the manufacturing sector, or bringing the technology that brings about all of those changes, or providing the knowledge services, or the validation and the testing. Well, all of this requires innovation. Innovation is a process that happens in a system or in a context, and the conditions around it, meaning the regulations, the societal pressure or the social pressures, meaning the risk perception, meaning the availability of financial resources, all of that are the framework conditions that are also important. So in this series, we are just bringing about a number of perspectives, and that's what we're going to do next, to present you for what I've just discussed. Let's say innovation, and in particular green innovation. We can identify that this is a multi-stakeholder systemic element. That what is the role of academia, what is the role of industry, and what is the role of government. Let's talk about innovation for sustainable development from an academic perspective. Do you agree, Albert? Innovation for sustainable development is a relatively new topic. If you compare it to chemistry, physics, or mathematics, we basically are in our infancy. It is only in the last 30 or so years that we have been talking about sustainable development, that we're talking about green innovation, green technologies. Although we can find examples of green solutions since the very start of the Industrial Revolution and perhaps even earlier. But let's assume that we agree that since the 1992 conference in Rio, and the coining of the term sustainable development, and the agreement that sustainable development was something that the political establishment was willing to promote, and the business community was also willing to promote, the academic community also started to formally adopting terms and to start thinking about how to marry the apparent conflict between bringing about economic growth and creating jobs and all those things that what we call the green economy nowadays aim to achieve, with processes of innovation and change that can actually help companies to improve their competitiveness and their competitive position in the markets, and to bring about new forms of innovation that can create more, let's say, public-oriented or socially oriented missions for the fulfillment and solving of environmental problems. Let's talk about eco-innovation, environmental innovation, ecological innovation, green innovation, environmentally sound innovation, clean tech innovation, circular innovation. All of these are terms that are currently associated to innovations that can contribute to sustainable development. Whether it's because you come from the financial world and then you are looking at the clean tech sector, or you come from ecological economics and then you think, well, eco is the way to go. All of these terms have one common association. They all talk about products, services, manufacturing processes, about business models, about management systems, about system level change that can actually have both environmental and economic benefits. And now if you add the social dimension to this, well, you could think that we would be talking about sustainable innovations, but in practice it's really difficult to really find examples of those. So in this field of knowledge, which is about, as I was saying, 30 years old, currently we have identified that there is about 20 different disciplines that you can actually identify that are contributing to the scholarly debate around green or eco-innovation. You can think of the fields of energy, management, social sciences, political sciences, and engineering in terms of engineering design or engineering processes and manufacturing. From many different angles, people are actually using terms that are associated to that. Why? Well, to a large extent, it has to do with the epistemological standpoint from this field, which is basically based on realism and pragmatism. What this means, I mean, I'm not intending to give you a lecture on epistemology of science, but pragmatism in these terms, it means that your methods are quantitative, qualitative, and then you go from a logic that is deductive and inductive, and in truth you accept the external reality as it is, meaning your ontology, and then you recognize that all these causal linkages may exist, but they cannot be clearly established. So in a way, values, the way you perceive reality, the way you perceive the problem, and how you socially construct the problem, and say, oh, listen, well, there is a smog over there, it might be raining. No, it's not rain, it's acid rain. And then I talk to someone and collectively we realize that is a problem. And as I was explaining to you in this early historical example of the development of wet scrubber, it is actually the evolution of institutional, technical, organizational, and all the types of change that actually bring about and help to bring about these innovations to the market. Now, there is no established definition for innovation, for sustainable development, or eco-innovation, or if you think about social inclusive innovation, there is no accepted definition. There are many operational definitions, there are many notions, but let's just for one moment agree that sustainability refers to triple bottom line, economic, social, environmental benefits. Innovation means, change. It means the production of new ideas and or the production of new methods that actually are used to generate value. And the combination of both the sustainability and the innovation, it can actually be used to bring about welfare or improve living conditions or improve the environmental situation of a company or a river. So we can think of this term as a term that has different connotations depending on the emphasis that you give, if it's more on the social or environmental element. Now, if you want to define eco-innovation, in Europe at least, we have already established an agreement that we refer to what is called a neo-Schumpeterian vision of innovation, where we say, okay, this refers to products, services, product services, marketing methods, organizational methods, system level changes that are implemented, developed, or transferred by companies and by users that produce this double benefit in terms of economic and environmental gain. And whether it's intentional or not, meaning the development could be motivated by many different drivers other than the environment, but in the end, if it has environmental benefits, well, we consider that as an eco-innovation. Similarly, there are no taxonomies or classifications that have been agreed worldwide. The existing definitions of at least eco-innovation are actually related to environmental technologies, and on the one hand, and to the vision and the version of innovation that is bring about the OECD in the Oslo Manual, that defines that there is organizational, product and service innovation, and the combination of both of them are being used as classifications that we need for operational purposes. So in a way, we have the first group of environmental technology. Think of water treatment, clean energy, air pollution technology. You can think of organizational innovations, for example, management systems or production prevention schemes or recycling and waste management methods that are implemented in manufacturing companies. You can also think about marketing and business model innovation in the sense of new marketing, communication, promotion, and actually the reformulation of your business plans and business strategies with an environmental and, in this case, social component. And you can think of products and process innovation, which is basically modification of existing manufacturing processes. Think, for example, of resource efficiency gains aided by smart manufacturing or the likes. Or when you think about product innovation in the sense of goods and services, think, for example, of eco detergents or eco plastics or the new generation of bio-based solutions that are used by consumers. Then we are talking about goods and services. And finally, and probably one of the latest developments in scholarly thinking is what we call the system level eco-innovation. System level can mean the food system, it can mean an urbanization, or it can mean a building, or it can mean the transport system. And it is actually related to combinations of all of the above, and it's very difficult to implement in practice. In spite of the progress that we have achieved so far in at least green innovation or eco-innovation, there are some issues that have not been solved entirely, and they have to do with the use of indicators, how you measure what really is green. Think, for example, of solar panels. The current solar panels, they are designed in a certain way that we are not thinking on the recyclability or recovering critical raw materials. Companies do it because it's part of the business, but it's not necessarily because the design of those systems were purposely made with that thing in mind. And we also have definitional issues. We don't have an agreement, and maybe we don't need to have an agreement in the exact definitions, because what works in Asia may not work in Brazil or in the US, but at least that we have a common understanding of this group of definition and similar terminologies. I think there is already progress so far, but still it is difficult to come to a single unified definition. Data generation, we still think of innovation in terms of patents and R&D expenditure. And whereas those are part of the inputs of innovation, meaning you create knowledge, you apply that knowledge, you valorize that knowledge, for example, by means of a patent or a license, and then you may create companies, or you can actually put that technology to use. That process, when you measure it only with patents, you are actually measuring inventive activity. There are ways of going around. Maybe if venture capital has been put in that patents and that patents has been put into a company, but measuring out case by case at national level, regional level, or world level is extremely difficult. We don't have the data series, we don't have the time series, and we don't have adequate indicators. This is just to see if something is actually counting as eco-innovation, and not to mention what is called rebound effects. Rebound effects is something that is derived from unintended consequences of the introduction of a product, service, or a technology in the long term in the economy. Think, for example, high-speed trains. High-speed trains are seen as environmentally friendly, less pollution and less CO2, yes, of course. But actually, what we don't know, if people traveling in high-speed trains, at least in Europe, they're actually maybe saving time and money that they're using in flights. You know, flights or maritime transport, which are actually currently not compensated because they are not obliged to mitigate the CO2 emissions. So there you have a distributional effect, and it's called the rebound effect, that maybe savings here in the transport system are actually producing overconsumption when someone goes and travels for leisure and, you know, doesn't really care if they are choosing plastic or paper. And probably one of the main challenges that we face from a scholarly and academic perspective is the identification of those innovations which, in real terms, in deterministic terms, are actually good for the environment, they're good for society, and they are good for the economy in a long-term systemic perspective. There are a number of examples of technologies, products, and services that at the micro scale, at the meso level, or at the macro level, they may not be exerting the sufficient change that we need for radically change our production and consumption system into something more sustainable. And because of that, the identification of champions where in other areas of policy may not be a solution, there seems to be a growing to what is called mission-oriented policies, and the knowledge behind it comes from academia and from science. So the identification of those big solutions that could really bring about radical change is a topic that requires attention. Finally, one of the things that is worth mentioning is that the scholarly work and the knowledge base that has been created in the last 30 years is actually being used by policymakers and by business. And maybe in other areas of knowledge this is not so evident, but at least we have come to terms that green innovation, social innovation, and sustainability, sustainable development goals are something decided by everybody. So there is a lot of work nowadays in what is called public-private partnerships, not only for commercial missions or for commercial purposes, but also for knowledge generation, in the way that if we think of the production and consumption system as something very intricate and dynamic and complex, well, solutions are elsewhere and not necessarily at your footstep. And that's why knowledge brokerage and science policy knowledge brokerage in particular are some of the areas where academics are going more and more, stopping from being isolated and thinking about solutions on their own to more collaborative processes where knowledge and policy questions can actually meet. Summing up, the academic view of innovation for sustainable development can be tracked back in time to more than 200 years. The modern understanding of environmental and social innovation, and in this case innovation for sustainable development, is relatively new. It's a field in the making. There is many entities, many communities, many knowledge fields that are actually working, and the need for platforms such as the Innovation for Sustainable Development Network and many others actually have a different meaning and a special meaning when we are consolidating a body of knowledge that is used for both business practice, and policy practice, which are the topics of our next conversation. Let's talk about business. Or not, Alfred? The business perspective of innovation for sustainable development. Why companies should invest in this? Is this a topic related to corporate social responsibility? Is it a topic related to profitability? Is it a topic linked to maintaining your license to operate? Or is it perhaps that you need to attract investment and you need to be ahead of competition? Or is it that you are looking for new opportunity areas? Or simply that you are just looking at paying salaries for the next month and to keep on running? Well, the business rationale of green and eco and sustainable and social has changed dramatically since the 1960s. It is well known that the pesticides case and chemical accidents worldwide called for the attention of society, business and governments in the need to have safer and cleaner operations. But society demands a clean environment anyhow. Governments are there to provide the rules of the game and to set up the framework conditions and to keep employment happening. And it's actually business and business owners and investors in the private sector that actually bear the burden of innovation and change. Why would you want to change if your market is already well established? Why would you need to change your business model? Why would you need to change your operations if you are making profit anyway? Since the 60s, there has been a massive change, but as I was mentioning earlier in the introduction, community pressures, business opportunities, economic risk, regulation, they all have a role to play in promoting innovation and change for sustainability. Now, it is also true, and probably that not many people know, that multinational companies, large business, well-established business, were instrumental in the 1992 Rio conference, and the creation of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development was one of the immediate actions, and a number of things happening around the world, and whatever you name it, cleaner production, responsible production, eco-efficiency, sustainable entrepreneurship, it's actually business that make that. It's actually companies, it's actually small companies that are actually in the making of all of that. But why is this? Is it because everything is now aligned and the pressure of society and the pressure of government? Yes, partly is because of that, but the fundamental difference is the sense of urgency that we now have from the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, and the huge business opportunities that have been created to solve those problems, and that requires solutions. And those solutions, in many cases, are already developed. In other cases, they need modification and transformation. And in other cases, we need to think the way we consume. But the business case for eco-innovation and the business case for innovation for sustainable development, if you think of it as a holistic approach, also takes into account public good situation where not only is good to control and to move beyond regulation, but it is also what this means for communities, for poverty alleviation, for safety and security, for satisfying human needs, that is now moving business into action. So it is important to also recognize that not everything has been worked well with manufacturing, with products and services, and with companies in general. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we have created the need of satisfying consumer preferences on the one hand, and we have over-created needs. We have actually created the products and services that shape our modern society. So maybe we wouldn't be here, and if developments in industry wouldn't be made possible, the miniaturization of microprocessors and the storage of energy. So technology, yes, it is needed, but technology has also created problems, because in the moment you extract resources, you are already modifying the natural state of things, and then you are actually altering the ecological system, and because of that, a number of physical and thermodynamic rules are actually put into action to try to restore and to try to generate a balancing in the system. Now, the truth is that we have reached a tipping point where a number of planetary boundaries have been exceeded. Everybody paid attention in the 60s and 70s about the ozone layer, and nowadays people is concerned about greenhouse gases, and people is also concerned about droughts and about erosion of soil and think we have reached a tipping point. And in the same way that technology has created solutions, it has created problems. So in this virtual and vicious cycle at the same time is where solutions, green, socially inclusive solutions are needed. The growing attention to business has also generated something that it has been called greenwashing. It is true that a number of cases and a number of companies and a number of entrepreneurs have actually taken advantage of the green credentials to make profit, and without actually bringing about environmental benefits. But let's put that aside. Let's imagine that, let's assume for the purposes of our series that it is possible to find responsible business people, responsible entrepreneurs that both ethically, socially responsible, and that believe that environment can be preserved and environment can be restored. So I have met them, so maybe you have also met them, and let's assume that this is possible. Now, the business imperative is to make profit, to maintain operations. So the own definition of a firm is a profit maximization unit. So in some way, it makes sense that there is infrastructure already developed, there is cost embedded in that infrastructure, and someone paid for that. And you need to recover your investment and make a profit, so you can actually, as a business owner, you can actually make your living, right? So the business perspective of innovation for sustainable development can be broadly divided into two, let's say, widely accepted situations or scenarios. The first one is when a company already exists, and then you face a choice to change something to make it greener or more socially sustainable, or when you create a new company and that company is born with green and social credentials. But companies do not interact in isolation. The very own background of innovation theory is focusing on firms, but firms are just entities, are artificial boundaries. It's actually people within companies that make the decisions based on the stimuli from the exterior, from the driver, from the motivations, from targets, from whatever. So it's actually this interaction between the individual and the company and the motivations and the mission that is very influential for something that we call strategy. Strategy is nothing but a process. You are here now and you want to be somewhere else in the future. The thing is that we have encountered in many cases, in many type of companies, there is no strategy in this sense. I mean, there is a well-defined portfolio of what you sell, what you produce, and why you produce it and why you sell it. But it's not that you are thinking about the long-term future and if whether your activities will be impacting the environment or not. And in the 70s, most companies in the first group, those companies that already existed, these companies were actually perceiving that everything had to do with the environment was actually costing them lots of money. The situation nowadays is different because companies have already found ways of profiting from this kind of solution driven world that we are living in, and startup companies and new companies and the intermediation services around companies and the distribution, and it is actually those companies with the largest influence in value chains and supply chains that actually implement the change. Think of one of the apparel industries worldwide that made their environmental profit loss accounts a few years ago, and they identified that only 7% of their environmental costs were attributable to their own operations. 93% of the rest were because of costs that came from their suppliers. Do you think this company in the apparel sector didn't have enough motivation to exert change? Did they have the power to do it? Yes, and they're doing it. And you can think also that from the retail sector. But in the end, companies need to maintain the license. So why is different and why is needed? So if we accept these two scenarios of companies that are existing and companies that are just being created, what we are witnessing now that even large corporations are creating venture capital funds and they're creating spin-out companies for those let's say clean tech or socially responsible investments like those reported in the social stock exchange in the UK are actually funded with corporate money. So in a number of occasions, I have had conversations with investors that until 5 to 7 years ago, they were telling me that 90% of the requests for investment they were receiving were for mobile apps. They said, we want to diversify. We know there is a business out there in energy and environmental services, but we're not getting enough requests. And that's why the entrepreneurial ecosystem, this is 7 years ago in Europe, and maybe that's the case in a number of countries. But the flourishing investment community that is willing to meet the demand of those entrepreneurs and is socially changing. So the entrepreneurial ecosystem is green. Yes. Is it socially inclusive? Yes. Yes, because there is a business rationale for investing and for profit maximization. There is nothing wrong in that. I'm actually employed by an organization, non-for-profit, but it's an organization that needs to pay my salary, right? And the same goes for universities. Everybody is in this way. Well, we actually need to create value. And innovation for sustainable development plays a different role when you think of not only this profit maximization, but bringing about social change. Finally, it's probably worth mentioning that sustainable companies can be created, but they can also be managed. And sustainable business management or eco-innovation management or strategy management are tools that nowadays are much more needed, and tools like road mapping, so knowing in which areas you're going to go in the future, which projects you're going to develop. They are more and more used by companies and business intermediaries worldwide. So if we agree that strategy is not something extraordinarily difficult, and that we can actually decide that sustainability is good for everybody, and there are processes of bringing about change, is where the role of the knowledge services and the business intermediaries interacting in these supply chains and in these value chains is where it becomes really important. And that's where government can support, and by creating the framework conditions for that. And we will talk about the government right next. What is the role of government in innovation for sustainable development? Here we can think of different levels of looking at this perspective. Isn't it, Obama? Innovation for sustainable development is and will probably continue being a topic of the highest political and policy interest. You can think of United Nations, you can think of the OECD, you can think of national governments, both in developed and developing countries, in emerging economies. In one way or another, they are all interested in innovation. They're mostly interested in technology and technology transfer, but in a number of cases, they do think about innovation as a way of meeting the targets established in the Paris Agreement, fulfilling their ambitions of the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals also have one of the targets and one of the goals itself. It's about innovation and industry, but innovation is also an enabler for a number of other Sustainable Development Goals. And innovation is also seen as a way of achieving a green economy, a fair economy, a circular economy, or simply speaking, economic growth. So governments are interested in innovation, and they're interested in the promise of innovation for sustainable development because of the growth potential that it can have for the countries, because of the solution to ecological and social problems it can bring about, but also because it can actually create jobs. Just in the Netherlands itself, 9.2 billion euros and 50,000 jobs is the promise that the circular economy brings to this country. And the International Labour Organization has made estimations of the amount of green jobs that can be created in the eco-industry worldwide. And the numbers are extremely positive. And this is why, at the highest political level, let's say, framework agreements and conventions that are negotiated by governments, and you can think from Rio to Kyoto to Rio again and to Paris. In all of these, they express their will to promote innovation somehow and to some extent. But what does it really mean for governments to promote innovation? Do they really pick winners? Do they really establish this innovation will go over that other innovation? Hang on, but isn't it innovation something that is ruled by market conditions? That competitive forces in the market are the ones that determine who is a survivor and who is not. And by the way, all of this terminology in innovation and innovation for sustainable development comes from biology, by the way. Competing species and the survival of the best. Can governments really do that? Can governments really say you do and you don't? You should and you should not? Well, countries can, if they have the mandate of the people to do it. And governments, for the purposes of this conversation, were seen as a single unity and as a single body that represents the national interest. But in practice, it is not like that. Depending where you live and depending on the form of government and the governance of your country, you may have that sometimes the office of the president or the prime minister is trying to do something, but the parliament or the Congress is not interested, or the municipalities are giving the burden and the money to bring about and implement local agendas for, you name it, sustainability, energy, climate, etc., etc. And then the complexity of the governance systems, they say, well, yes, I want to do it, but how? Where do we start? Should I do it now? And then later I realized that I actually shouldn't have done it. We know many experiences of national governments and regional governments and local governments that were willing and able and capable, and they went about in implementing or adopting green technologies or green services that later to realize that it was actually very costly. I'm just going to give you an example. Happening right now, European countries. Some European countries, the national level, has set up targets for waste management. And those countries, in a number of, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years, they have almost 0% of waste going to landfill. And that's a national policy. And on the other hand, municipalities were given the authority and the mandate to do something about energy provision, I mean, for example. And then this, at some point in time, it was thought that the waste to energy systems or waste to incineration were actually viable ways of bringing about the energy solutions of the local, and they are in many ways. But because of the lack of anticipation that a national policy would contravene the positive effects of a local policy, there are a number of cases where those municipalities sign contracts for 15, 20, 30 years with waste to energy systems, and they're actually now importing the waste from other countries because locally they don't have much more waste as an input and as an energy source. And believe me that that's a luxury problem when we're talking about this kind of issues in terms of policy design, of policy monitoring. In many other countries, what I'm talking about waste and energy and all of that it's a luxury in the sense that other countries have other priorities primarily linked to health, nutrition and poverty, and then it becomes the governance of the global innovation and the global sustainability becomes quite complex, because on the one hand you have developed nations that have achieved certain level of satisfaction of their needs, and you have developing countries that say, hey, I also want it, but is it the right model of development? I'm not going to answer that question, but it's a point for your own thinking. But what I'm telling you is that governments can actually intervene where the market fails. But nowadays, and it is more and more recognized, that the governments have the capacity to intervene also to ameliorate the framework conditions and to correct failures in the system. System of what? System of innovation, system of consumption and production and distribution, system of education. So it's not only about the market that dictates, and that neoclassical economics view of the hand that intervenes to correct something that is wrong in the market has been long surpassed in a number of countries, that they are looking at policy intervention from a holistic perspective, thinking, if I support here now, what will be the effect in the near future? And I bring about the example again of solar PV technology. IRENA, the Renewable Energy Association, produced a report not long ago that talks about the business case for recycling systems for solar PV. And they made an inventory all over the world, and it happens that only a handful of countries have the conditions and the technology and the distribution systems to actually do something with their own future and potential waste. And what government should do in this case? Well, anticipation of the future is also an area where governments can actually look into. But let's think for a moment that, well, if we recognize that governments have a mandate, let's assume that people tell them, you have the mission to help us to achieve sustainable development, to fight climate change, and let's assume that they are capable and willing, and they have the monitoring systems in place to set up an agenda and to move along the policy processes towards implementation. And where do they start? So what are those areas of policy intervention that probably should require attention and urgent attention in national policies? Well, or local policies? Well, the answer is not straightforward, but we have an idea about it. In the policy world, you may always hear issues about policy coordination, policy alignment, targeting and visions sometimes. And that sounds highly eloquent, but how do you actually do that? I mean, how do you actually implement the so-called policy mixes? How do you actually make sure that if you are sitting in the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Industry and Innovation, and the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Water Affairs would actually go about and actually coordinate? Well, that's not an easy task, and that's at the national level one of the big headaches, not only for the implementation of the SDGs, you know, the coordination of interministerial coordination, but also for bringing about any action at any level, whether it's at the highest political level or at the action level, a project that can actually bring about social and environmental benefits. But let's assume that we can simplify the areas of policy intervention where innovation for sustainable development, and in particular green innovation and eco-innovation, can actually be established. This is an oversimplification, of course, but let's think only of environmental policies and science, technology, and innovation policies. Obviously, you could always think about consumer policies and industrial policies if you have them, and many other areas. But let's, for the sake of simplicity, let's think of these two areas. You would be surprised to know the number of supply-side measures and demand-side measures that are actually the same. You may just call it differently. But subsidies, target setting, trading schemes, management systems, and regulation, they are all implemented. So it's not necessarily about the type of instrument, it's about the complementarities and the synergistic power that these instruments can bring about. Talking about policy coordination and achieving progress requires good policy planning, but also good policy implementation. Think, for example, of the life cycle of a product. Think of resource material extraction, production, distribution and retail, consumer use and end of life. Imagine that you could design a program that from beginning to end can actually bring about systemic change in the housing system or in the transport system. That in itself, something idealistic, has already been achieved elsewhere. The UK government in the 1990s to the mid-2005, they had a sustainable consumption program that in very specific areas actually managed to substitute certain products and substitute it by greener products. And also the UK is now very vibrant in terms of social enterprises, and the social stock exchange is one of the examples of that. And the charity bank and a few other initiatives. Why are they flourishing there and not here? It's because of the framework conditions. So the well-functioning of an innovation system, the well-functioning of a sustainable consumption and production system are important factors. And what is the role of government in those? The removal of barriers, the enhancement of drivers, and the guidance, and that invisible hand that sometimes in economics you really don't want to talk about. Well, here, call it soft intervention if you may, but when there is a public good situation, the government has the ability and the capacity to intervene. That is a determining factor in green innovation. One of the things that is less understood in policy making is probably how to bring about change from lesser stages of development to higher levels of development. And that may apply for existing establishments, existing companies, industrial sectors, when you can actually create programs that move from cleaner production or from pollution prevention to circular economy and industrial ecology. But it is also possible to create sustainable or sustainably driven innovation or innovation-based firms. And now, it is not easy because experience tells that sometimes this process of change can take a decade or more. And that's also a challenge in terms of a number of countries, because policy cycles are rather short. At the local level, you're talking about 2, 3, 4 years if you're lucky. In many cases, there is no option for re-election. In some countries, it is possible. When you're talking about national government, you talk about cycles of 4, 6, or 8 years. And that in policy terms, it is actually often a barrier. However, in spite of the limitations, there has been a lot of progress in achieving sustainable development goals and in promoting innovation. But we're talking about a topic that has a global dimension. The knowledge is here, it's applied elsewhere, and all of these trade and knowledge flows cannot be easily controlled or monitored by governments. And that's why international cooperation is so important in terms of knowledge platforms, policy platforms, business forums, and to a large extent also the knowledge diaspora, that is people living in other countries that can actually be a linking pin to your own national or your own local initiative. So it is true that we have achieved some progress. The challenges are great, but I can testify that both local governments, regional governments, national governments, councils, parliamentarians, they are motivated to bring about change, and innovation is a way to foster sustainability.